London is the place for me. London, this lovely city. You can go to France or America, India, Asia or Australia, but you must come back to London City.
Whoa, 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 yeah. Whoa, yeah. You hear me when I say, whoa, 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 yeah. Whoa, yeah, whoa, whoa. You hear me when I say.
The conquest of Africa by the European colonising empires that lasted for over 3.5 centuries ripped through age-old civilizations, tearing societies, communities and families apart. Africans would tumultuously revolt against their oppressors. On both continents, connected by the Middle Passage as well as at sea, countless of them chose certain death instead of slavery by throwing themselves in the ocean or fighting their enslavers and sinking with their burning ships. The bottom of the Caribbean Sea is said to be covered with the bones of those that perished.
The British took over Jamaica in the 1660s.
The Spanish had left their enslaved African people there who had taken off into the hinterland of Jamaica and joined with native people, and they became what we now call Maroons. They were my people. And we went to the most inaccessible places and we fought a guerrilla war against these new occupiers for the next 100 years. In the usual fashion, the British sat down around a table and negotiated a treaty with Maroon people that they would have autonomy in certain areas in Jamaica, but in exchange they would have to agree to, if anybody, there were runaways from the plantations, they were supposed to return them. And if there were any rebellions or uprisings, they were supposed to help to suppress them. But they were very smart. You know, they knew how to cooperate minimally with those conditions.
The history of Jamaica is one of resistance.
The enslaved Africans had their own provision grounds where they grew their own food and they had their own markets. And this was before even slavery was abolished. So there was a certain level of independence amongst African origin people there, which didn't exist in other islands or in the United States.
By the end of the 18th century, there were more than 300,000 enslaved people in Jamaica. 16 slave uprisings had taken place between 1655 and 1813.
Britain was the largest empire that ever existed on earth. The British Empire was an economic system that the sun never set. It covered a third of the Earth's surface. The role of people of African origin, the role of people of Asian origin, were always as basic units of production. The British didn't go and penetrate our places because they loved the topography or the geography or the scenery. They went there because they saw economic opportunity. Profit was made on every leg of that journey. They sailed to Africa full of goods. Those goods were exchanged with local traders for people. Those people were then taken to the New World and they were auctioned or sold to the plantation owners for a cost. They then took the product of their labor, which was either sugar, tobacco, cotton, whatever it was. They were sold on the marketplace here and made a third stream of profit. Once Britain became industrialized, that slave economy, that almost feudalistic way of doing things, became obsolete. Because now you could control labor using the wage. You didn't have to chain people up and ship them across the world. You could put them in factories and they would make as much, if not more, profit.
By the 1820s, more than 2,500 enslaved people were escaping from the plantations each year. The British abolished transatlantic slavery on August 1st, 1834.
At the end of slavery, the British government actually compensated the slave masters for the loss of the slave, but they did not compensate the slave. They didn't give them parcels of land to say, go, say, take care of yourself now, you're free.
My mum used to teach when she was at school in Jamaica, but her education was all about British history. Yeah. Even now, you know, my mum can recite things from school that she learned, which were all about Walter Raleigh and, you know, Queen Elizabeth, the reign of Henry VIII, all of that British history she knows. I don't think she knows anything about Jamaican history, to be honest with you, because they weren't taught it in schools.
People were proud to be British. You know, we had the Union Jack. If we went to the cinema at the end of the film, we would get up and we would sing the British national anthem and be very proud of it, because there's nothing else to be proud of. Yeah, because most of our sense of ourselves as Africans were wiped away a long time, for a long time before that.
A new nation is born. The island of Jamaica, for 307 years a British possession, welcomes Princess Margaret and the Earl of Snowdon here to represent Queen Elizabeth at independence ceremonies. The country will be a dominion within the British Commonwealth and thus still maintain ties to all that the princess represents. The new nation will need continuing aid before she becomes self-sufficient, a new member of the family of democratic nations.
I remember growing up and my mum having pictures of the Queen in the house, and you know, a picture of the white Jesus in the corner, because all they know is what the British were teaching them.
Education in Jamaica was very necessary, and there were some children who didn't have the opportunity because of their parents' background, and the parents were extremely poor.
The only higher education that was available to people in the Caribbean up to the 1940s was to be a Rhodes Scholar. And one Rhodes Scholarship per island were allowed each year, and you'd have to come to Oxford and Cambridge to study. There was no higher education in the Caribbean itself.
We grew up and we were of a class where you couldn't go into the store and buy a toy.
My parents were poor as well, but they did every possible thing to let us maintain our life at school.
Jobs were very few and far between. There were mainly bottom-level jobs as cane cutters, dock workers, and the wages were very depressed because the economic situation was very depressed. So if you wanted to look for opportunity, you had to go elsewhere. People of colour were barred from joining the Navy and the Army to begin with. But as a number of them started to die, they opened up too. Disproportionately, Caribbean people served in the armed forces per head of population. So my family were directly involved in that.
My father was a war veteran, and I've got his medals. Would you like to see them?
You couldn't come as an ordinary citizen from Jamaica. Even though you were British and you would have had a British passport, you couldn't travel to Britain, right? The people who were allowed here were the professionals or those who came to study. 1948 was this opening, and it took a long time for the British to actually decide that they were going to let these strange people in.
Arrivals at Tilbury. The Empire Windrush brings to Britain 500 Jamaicans. Many are ex-servicemen who know England. They serve this country well.
And so there's a great deal of euphoria locally about the fact that now we can actually go to the mother country.
On the 22nd of June, 1948, The Empire Windrush passenger liner brought 492 passengers to Britain. 10 years later, in London alone, the African Caribbean diaspora had already reached a population of 115,000 people. They faced discrimination in finding accommodation and employment.
Britain in the 1940s and early 50s was quite a devastated place. It had 2 world wars throughout that century, within a period of 40 years. Its infrastructure was flagging. They'd had to nationalise the railways because they were in a mess. They'd set up the National Health Service. A radical Labour government had been elected in 1945 to undertake reconstruction of the country, and it was desperate for labour.
My father left Jamaica in 1956. He was a baker. He had his own bakery. But there came a time when he was unable to get hold of flour, the bread flour for baking bread. And so he had no alternative but actually to leave and come here along with a lot of other people who were leaving at the time.
Before we left, we heard that conditions are very bad over here with regards to accommodation. But we were quite brave enough to come along.
A lot of the people who would rent to black people at that time were from the Jewish community, yeah. Jewish landlords. Yeah. Mainly because, I think possibly because they, maybe they'd had similar experiences themselves of being minorities and knowing what that was like.
My father rented a bed on the top floor of this 4-story terrace house. He rented a double bed. So there were 3 of us in the bed, my father, my younger brother, and myself, in a room with 3 other beds and 3 men living in that same room.
And there was certainly in Lambeth, there were some well-known Jewish landlords who literally they owned properties all over the place, and they were almost like social landlords in the end.
Comes September, October, as it starts to get cold, people start to light up these coke and coal-fueled heating system for their boilers and so on. And the place would end up like what they call a thick pea soup of fog.
The weather was extremely bad. The first pair of boots I had was brown velvet boots. They were so heavy, and the snow was high up. You don't see much snow these days. In those days, snow was up to 3-4 feet up.
I was born and grew up in Kingston, never more than 15 minutes away from the sea, never more than half an hour away from the hills and the mountains. That's where I lived, at number 3 Geneva Road for the first 6 months. Went to school for the first time, had to kind of struggle to even understand the language of the young people because they spoke Cockney, I spoke Jamaican. They couldn't understand what I was saying, but there were 3 other people who they couldn't understand, and they were Scottish from Glasgow. And the Cockney people couldn't understand. So they took me into their little gang and took care of me for 2 years.
Bulldog, don't bite me. Bulldog, don't bite me.
Ole, 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 reed dog.
Bulldog, don't bite me.
You bite your master, but you won't bite me.
Bulldog, don't bite me.
Miss O'Leary had a great big dog.
Bulldog, don't bite me.
That thing, it looked just like a hog.
Bulldog, don't bite me.
One day, Miss O'Leary, I went to see.
Bulldog, don't bite me.
And I remember one day I saw something in a local newspaper in Brixton, and it said there was an exhibition of cartoons by Leonardo da Vinci. What it did was it got me into the National Gallery, and I started looking at paintings, started looking at sculpture. But then I discovered African art, because there's a museum not far from here. It's called the Horniman Museum. Images of great African kings, yeah? Great queens, beautiful queens, great warriors. And I'd never seen black stroke African people depicted in that way in all my life.
I wanted to do something with children because I love teaching and so forth. And I got a job in a nursery with all white children, little white kids. And there was a dear little white girl. She usually just come looking at me. And her mother used to, say to her, go on then. And in the end, I said, is something wrong? She said, no, she really wants to come near to you. I said, please let her come. Then she tipped her finger on her tongue and she said, she went home and told her mom that she's sorry for me because I'm dirty. They had no knowledge of black people. And in the end, that little girl, she wouldn't even go out at playtime. She just kept close to me.
My parents came over here in the early 60s from Barbados. My mum was a cook. She was a cleaner. Those were only the kind of jobs that were available to women. And for men, the jobs that were available were working on the buses as a bus conductor, working for London Underground. I mean, if you look at those jobs, back in the day, most bus conductors were black. Most cleaners were black. It was just the way it was.
My husband and I, we love children. And we just decided that we'd have our children and still go to work. And we worked on opposite shifts, one in, one out. My husband would be at the doorway waiting in his London Transport uniform, waiting for me to come, give me a peck on the cheek and said, see you later. Then we'd take day off together.
The first job I went for an interview after school was with the British Railways Archives Department. And it was a very basic arithmetic and English test, which, of course, it wasn't difficult to get through. But at the end of the interview, the man said to me, you do realize that this is not a job for colored people.
So people came, worked in the building industry, transport industry, managed to get somewhere to live, and soon had to deal with the problems of life, and came together, and the way they'd come together back home in the 30s to set up trade union movements and other organizations, the same way as soon as they arrived here, they had to start organizing to deal with their social and economic interests.
We went into Ashmere Grove, and then my husband asked the neighbors, is there a pub around here that my wife and I could go and sit down and have a drink? I said, yeah, there's a pub up there, but they've never seen black people going there. And my husband said, that's where we're going, And when we went in, it was packed with all these white people. And there was this elderly man who played the piano. The music was fantastic. But my husband, he just took me from my seat, and we started to dance. And all these ladies, after a while, wanted to dance with him. And when we told people how we were welcome there, they couldn't believe us.
Don't you think you could cause trouble by having your headquarters here? On the contrary, the trouble was here long before we set up our headquarters in this area.
The fact is that the people, not having previously a constitutional political outlet for their indignation at the evils of the coloured invasion, resorted to blind violence.
Well then, what's your solution to the problem?
Well, we believe in preventing the evils which must result from coloured immigration by removing the problem completely. And to do that by stopping all further coloured immigration into our country and repatriating, with every humane consideration, the coloured immigrants already here.
The Windrush generation of post-1948 people who came here, because black people have been here for hundreds of years, thousands of years probably. But the reason why a lot of those people clustered was for personal safety, because you knew it's literally safety in numbers. Not only that, demographically, you know, people would say, this is a black area, but there was a concentration of black people. So within that local environment, you may have stores that would cater to their needs, or you'd have little markets that would cater to their needs. So that explains that. And also there were so many no-go areas. For instance, in Peckham, which is another borough in southeast London, there were parts of Peckham where black people could not go. You knew if you went anywhere near those estates or walked down those roads, you were going to get a beating, you were going to get attacked, and it was pointless going to the police.
There were notices that would say, no blacks, no dogs, no Irish.
These signs are very, very disturbing. You know, no blacks, no dogs, you know, and it was very sad. It was common at that time, which I think was like mental cruelty.
In Brixton, near to where the heart of the black community was in that time, there was a big wall. I remember used to walk towards Summerlayton Road, which was the heart of our community. And the wall there had KBW, massive, 6-foot letters. Somebody came there one night, and it stayed there for years. I don't know why. People didn't take it down. But I didn't know what it meant as a young boy until later I found out what it meant.
Keep Britain White, KBW, and that would be plastered all over.
And so by the late 50s, for example, you had people like Claudia Jones, and had been deported by the American authorities who saw her as too radical. And she came here in the early 50s and helped organise against the naked racism that started to express itself. Black people in West London were being attacked in their homes, on the street when they were going to work. And my father told me that when people started to hear what was going on, they said, we can't let this continue. They travelled over to Notting Hill, and when they arrived in Ladbroke Grove, if they got out and saw a teddy boy, a man with a bicycle chain or a razor, which was what the weapons they used, they got out and they confronted him. And if he showed that he was a racist, they'd chop him up. And they did this systematically, and then they left Notting Hill. And after that, they stopped attacking black people in Notting Hill.
Say we were 6 or 7 years old, you could get white people come up to us and they would rub their hands in our hair like this, because it was for luck and stuff like that, because they could just do that, yeah. They go, right, Sambo, right, Nignog, and whatever. And the funny thing is, although those names are racist and you'd never get away with them today, it was woven into the fabric. It was acceptable behaviour. If somebody called you a Sambo, a coon, a nigger, a wog, or a spade, you know, you would be offended. You may even want to fight them, depending on what day it was. But you were kind of used to it. You'd get it through the TV, on TV shows like Till Death Us Do Part, Alf Garnett, they had that in there. You know, most of the TV programs and the media reflected that. You know, in one of the elections in the 60s, I think it was, you know, one of the Conservative MPs said, if you want a nigger for a neighbour, vote Labour.
That struggle to survive still continues, and out of that struggle comes a whole culture, like a whole culture of music, for example, which is reggae music, which is a music of resistance. So we simply brought that here with us.
The contribution of the growing African-Caribbean community to British music and culture became evident early on in the 50s and 60s. Subcultures like the Mods the Skins, and the Rude Boys found their inspiration in the ways of the people that came mainly from the Caribbean. This influence increased and reverberated formidably throughout British mainstream culture in the 70s and the 80s, thanks to the preceding and ongoing calypso, reggae, blues, folk, gospel, soul, and funk scenes.
And of course, when we came here, it was the beginning of the music industry in Jamaica. So we would be importing the music to play here.
Rude Boys were the first cultural phenomenon. They're the ones they dressed in what was called two-tone mohair and wore American brogues and trilby hats like this one. And they were very stylish, Ben Sherman shirts. And they would go to West End clubs and the white young people there would see them and think, whoa, you like this? And we set the trend for many years.
English people didn't really wear suits. Englishmen didn't dress up. They might wear a suit on a Sunday.
Now, may I ask you your name?
Lord Kitchener.
Lord Kitchener. Now, I'm told that you are really the king of calypso singers, is that right?
Yes,
well, now, will you sing for us?
Right now.
We had the street cordoned off at the top and at the bottom all the way around. You know, we became one. It was fantastic. And every year, until we left that place, a street party. Music, dancing.
When the Windrush generation came, the situation in Britain was pretty unpleasant. It was post-war. People didn't have much money. Traditional working class styles of culture didn't appeal to black people that much. Music halls and drinking down the pub, singing Cockney songs really didn't come in our repertoire. So when people came along, they had to create their own entertainment.
When my parents' generation first came here, there was no clubs for black people to go to. So what they started what we call house parties.
Now a sound system is like a huge PA system, great big wardrobe-like boxes with speakers that size, and they would punch. And so they'd never seen anything like that before here. And that came out of Jamaica of the 1940s when the first technical college was actually constructed. Some of the new electrical engineers designed amplifiers specifically for the marketplace.
People brought that same system here. You couldn't set up on the street in the UK because it's not a tropical environment. But in our houses, we would hold socials and dances and shubeens and blues parties.
And we cooked food, curry goat and rice, fish and rice. And basically it used to be, that's how people used to socialize and people used to get dressed up.
While in that environment, you know, it attracted me. I found it exciting. So I would go and my uncle's stack would be there in terms of his amplifier and his record player. And he'd say to me, boy, go and get this for me. Boy, go and get that for me. Boy, put on that record. And I started playing records, 11 and 12 years old.
So we evolved, yeah, to the point where the music became so powerful that it took over the indigenous. You understand? It took them over and transformed their sense of music. Most of the young people, the so-called mods of the 1960s, right, followed Jamaican music. They would die for Jamaican music. Ska evolved into rocksteady, rocksteady evolved into reggae, and the rest is history.
Simmer down, cool down your temperature, simmer down. That was the Wailers' first tune. That was recorded with Sir Coxsone in 1962, when Bob was a teenager. And Coxsone liked Bob. Bob became homeless, so Coxsone allowed him to sleep in his studios. And Bob was able to sit in the studios all day, and then he appointed him as a kind of continuity man. He would set up the equipment, make sure everything was done properly. And Ram Jam was a place that all the best in reggae and soul music played there. So James Brown, the whole of the Watts Stax group, you know, Otis Redding, all those people played at the Ram Jam. So I used to climb out my bedroom window. I used to risk my life. My bedroom was on the top floor of my house, right? So I shin down the drain pipe because my father wouldn't let me out the house. He didn't want me in trouble. He had ambitions for me. And when I got there, right, you'd come together in this very intimate setting, all this music playing, and you'd meet young women from all over the place, because young women would steal out of their houses and come here from Portsmouth and from all over the country, get on the train and come to Lamb Jam Club. And there was us, all of us, meeting in this space as young people, listening to the music of our generation.
Many Britons struggled to accept the reality of coexisting with the newcomers. Demagogues recognised this as an opportunity and were eager to exploit the anxieties that had ensued. They sought to flare hatred and sow division in the hope of a major power grab.
In this country, in 15 or 20 years' time, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man. We must be mad. Literally mad as a nation to be permitted the annual inflow of some 50,000 dependents who are for the most part the material of the future growth of the immigrant descended population. It is like watching a nation busily engaged in heaping up its own funeral pyre.
This speech, everybody remembers where they were. It's like you remember where you were when Kennedy was shot. When that speech was played on the news, in our communities, it sounded like people were declaring war on us. Here was a prominent Conservative Party politician making a statement that he saw us as a threat, that particularly as young people, we were going to grow up and go and strangle his people or stab them or kill them or throw them in the river.
I think that the whole language of integration is such a problematic one. What's forgotten is that those people who ended up making Brixton their home, who were from the Caribbean islands, were citizens of the British Empire. Many of them knew much more about the legacy and culture of England than people like my parents.
If you don't know people, then you imagine what they're like, yeah? And I think there was a lot of that going on, plus a throwback from the old days. I mean, all the films, things on TV, anything you saw was always about, you know, black savages in the bush with spears and stuff like that. I mean, it's ridiculous thinking about it now.
Racism, for me, is multifaceted because racism isn't just prejudice, like I don't like this person because of the way they look. Racism is part of a power system. It's a system of power.
The functions of racism in degrading those who are below in order to secure your own position, even though your own position might be tenuous, is really important. That's why people cling to those ideas. So I think in a way we have to try and understand what it is that those ideas do.
Maybe not only do you not respect that racial group, but you also have the power to impose certain things on that group. You can structurally place members of that group anywhere you like, politically, socially, culturally, and economically.
I remember growing up vividly, and you know, there was an Asian family who lived where we lived in Battersea that always used to get their windows smashed, that always used to get a lot of hell, you know, and back then, to me, because I was so young, I thought that was just normal.
What remains constant in all of those moves, if you like, is that there are others who don't really belong, and there is us.
Growing up and having, you know, white girlfriends, you know, it was the norm that you were never ever going to get to go to their house. I mean, they was always allowed to come to my house, but I was never allowed to go to their house.
For example, a very close friend of mine who I played sport with actually, I remember going into his mother's house, Mrs. Robinson her name was, she lived in Tulse Hill, and I remember her saying to, it was a white coach actually. I spent most of my young life obsessed with playing basketball actually, and it was a space where there was racial integration at the time. This white coach went to see Mrs. Robinson and said, you know, I want Stephen, my friend, to spend more time playing sport. And she said, no, he's not going to be spending more time playing sport because he needs to focus on his studies, right? And what she said, I shall never forget, was one of the first lessons in what a different world might be like. She said, you know, these two boys, when they're in my front room, I don't see them as different. But when they walk outside, the world sees one black boy and one white boy.
One of the main differences, I would say, the intergenerational differences between my parents' generation and ours with regards to the environment and how we kind of navigated our way through the environment. When our parents came here, you know, they came here generally to work, they were in work.
We were young people, we were going to school, we'd started to experience racism in the school. And around about this time in the early 1970s, a book was published called How the West Indian Child is Made Educationally Subnormal in the English School System. This generated a massive response from the black community. We started to set up our own supplementary schools that opened in the evenings at weekends.
My parents came from the Caribbean. They came from Jamaica. Where they came from in Jamaica, in a place called Clarendon, when you went to school to learn, and your teachers respected you more so than the teachers respected us over here. So when we told our parents that, you know, teachers may call us monkeys or abuse us in class, you know, treat us like we're too thick, you know, too unintelligent to grasp what they're teaching us, just because we're black. A lot of our parents didn't believe that.
My next door neighbours and everyone that was around me growing up were white. You know, my parents were exposed to white people, but they just didn't. If there was any racism, I very much doubt that it affected them, because my parents were just here to get on with work and provide for us.
I became active as a teenager because there was no facilities or place for us to go outside school hours. And me and my friends used to hang around and on the street, and then we'd get hassled from the police. And then we'd try and hang out at home, and then we'd upset parents because we'd start to damage the house, and there was not space there because we had to rent out all the rooms. So this question of where could we be?
Keep calm, keep calm. No matter what the raging storm, keep calm, keep calm. You never do you no harm. Keep calm, keep calm.
We would utilize those spaces like as like church community centers or church halls. We would turn them into like youth clubs or utilize them as youth clubs. There are some still going in Brockley now, South East London, that have probably been going for over 40, 50 years.
And the room was, you know, not large, 20 by 20. And we didn't have any equipment. We had just a record player and 2 packs of cards and a pack of dominoes. And within a month, there was literally 200 young people, our peers, trying to force their way into this one little room with this meagre facility.
Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, the presence of black children in British schools was seen as problematic. Portrayed as unable to get to grips with the English language, suffering from negative self-image and struggling with identity crises, many children were written off and subsequently dumped in educationally subnormal schools.
The first generation of black children who went through the education system here, right, certainly experienced a lot of what would now be classed as racism. What it came down to really was just low expectations.
If you were born in the 50s and 60s and you went to school here, you know, you may not have been encouraged to even go on to do, you know, A-levels and further education, let alone going to university. Now there are programs and there are initiatives to actively encourage young black and ethnic minorities to think about higher education.
I remember one of my teachers, although I was more or less a straight A student at school, and I've got a twin brother and he was the same, you would get teachers who would tell us we were too thick to do a thinking man's job. And one of them actually said to me in class in front of all the other children, you know, I'm too thick to get a thinking man's job. I better either go and work on a building site as a labourer or in a biscuit factory, because you used to have a lot of factories then.
I had a teacher tell me that, you know, I wouldn't be able to study linguistics because it's just really, really, really hard. And I said, okay, but, you know, why? And she said, because she found it really hard. So she found it hard. How am I going to be able to find it, get on with it? So that was kind of an early experience for me, and I also had experience of teachers telling me I wouldn't pass my GCSE, my English GCSEs, and I did. And a lot of that was not based on my performance.
There are particular factors that affect Afro-Caribbean boys that maybe don't affect other groups. The main one of these is the teaching practices and classroom management style that has become dominant in British schools in the last 30 to 40 years. One which, according to many critics from within the Afro-Caribbean community, is excessively feminised and not sufficiently in tune with the cultural needs and expectations of West Indian boys and Afro-Caribbean boys in particular.
It's not that teachers were racist and that they thought, oh, these black children are rubbish, you know, so we don't want to teach them. Sometimes it was almost a benevolent kind of racism where it's almost like, oh, you poor little thing, you know, life is probably really hard for you and, oh, you probably won't understand this, so I won't try and explain it.
Having your 11 plus, you had to do an IQ test, which I came out with flying colours. Afterwards, I was interviewed myself and my father by the headmaster in his gown and his cap and everything. He came to me and he said, we don't have many of you people who apply here. Last time we had one young man, he was very naughty and we had to expel him. I hope your son isn't like that. It was clear what the implication was. Surprise, surprise, a few days later I had a letter to say the school was full. My white friend, who, you know, I used to go walk to school with him and back, and to be charitable to him at that time, he was thick as 2 short planks. His parents gave him extra tutoring or whatever, so he scraped through his 11 plus. He went for his interview the week after me and was given a place in the school.
One of my daughters who recently qualified as a medical doctor, when she was at primary school, she was the highest achieving student. And for the first year, they were going to give out a prize to the highest achieving student. Her teacher said to her, you are the only child who can win this. So at the assembly, the special assembly, when they were giving out the prizes, you know, when they said, yes, we're going to call out the name of the first student who's going to win this award, her teacher patted her on the back for her to get up, and the head teacher gave it to a white child who didn't have the same standards as my daughter.
What's interesting is that you look at some of those kids who went through the system and they are massive achievers. Lots of them went on to university and stuff, but later on, off their own backs.
I later went to Goldsmiths College to study for my first degree, right? And that was on merit because I had the qualifications. But I was only one person that went there. None of my other peers that I'd grown up with managed to get into college.
You had people like my sisters who really worked hard in school, and I mean, I messed around in school, and a lot of guys like myself from Brixton, we left school early. You know, we left school at 16, 15, 16, and we were being employed by the Jewish, mainly Jewish jewelers, were giving us a chance, giving us opportunities. So you had guys who were doing jewelry polishing, jewelry diamond setting, casting, and so for some reason the Jewish community in Hatton Garden gave us a break. We used to go in Brixton called Allardyce Hall, for instance, which was a church hall in Brixton, and every Thursday night there used to be sound system there, and most Saturday nights you'd be a sound system there. You could go there, and you got sounds and sound competition.
So that's where the teenagers could go. They also had things like sports clubs, discussion groups, particularly like beginning of the 80s, where the whole sort of black consciousness movement started to develop.
Reggae music especially broke down so many barriers because, as I said, you know, a lot of the white kids who grew up with us would come to our houses and hear that music. And then they would come to some of the clubs with us as well. So their appreciation of us as so-called others was qualitatively different from their parents.
Having played with my uncle, who'd brought his sound with him from Jamaica, and who'd infected me with that disease of love of music and playing music for other people, as soon as I became of age, I wanted to establish my own system.
There was some peculiarities, and one was a club in a place called Sydenham in southeast London, where you would get the black boys on one side of the club and the white boys, mostly skinheads, on the other side of the club. And skinheads were notorious for fighting with us as kids and stuff like that. But you would get that mix, and it was a strange kind of environment because you had a black sound system playing mostly Jamaican reggae music, and you had the skinheads over there appreciating it, You had the black boys over here, and then at the end of the night, we would go our separate ways and go home.
In order to get the sound around, you had to get a vehicle. As soon as you get a vehicle, there's another area you're going to conflict in the police. They'd see you, they'd stop you.
Sociological literature especially is replete with books that deal with that. But they talk about that increased visibility and that threat of the black male, especially on the streets.
The British police force, unlike every other force in Europe, does not make a distinction between the criminal investigation function of policing and the gendarmerie function, the maintaining of order in public places. These are carried out by the same integrated police force.
For the black people, it felt very much like an onslaught. Yeah, and I certainly know, although I wasn't involved in anything, I mean, I even went to an all-white school, when I was growing up, I was always afraid of the police.
Now, what periodically happens is that the idea takes place that the way to actually reduce the incidence of crime, and particularly crime in public places, is to combine those two functions. And what this means is that the police adopt an extremely aggressive attitude towards certain kinds of things being carried on in public places, in streets, in parks, in places like that. They clamp down on them, they harass the people involved in them, they maybe arrest them, and this invariably leads to a serious breakdown in relations between the community involved and the police force. This happened with the Irish community in the 19th century, and it also happened very significantly with the Afro-Caribbean community during the 1970s and early 80s.
The police are supposed to be there to take care of you. There was always that thing growing up, if you're on the street and you're in any trouble, go and find a policeman. That's what they teach you in school.
I remember this like it was yesterday, but I was 16 years old. So I went across the road and I bought a can of Coke and a Mars bar, which is a chocolate bar. And I asked my friend if he wanted a bite, and when he went to take a bite, I pulled it away really quickly, and I just said he was too blood clot craven, which meant he's too greedy. And then a policeman came across the road with another policeman, a cadet, and I could see he was a cadet, a trainee, because he had this blue band around his head. And the policeman arrested me for swearing and for swearing at the Queen. That's what he said to me. So he took me away. Now, back then, it just seemed that anything wrong that we did, you'd get beatings for it from our parents. That's the way it was for me. That's how I remember it. And I knew I didn't do anything wrong, but I was so scared. And I remember being taken back to, I think it was either Wandsworth Police Station at the time, I think it was. And I remember getting into the police station and the policeman making up all of these lies. You know, I'm standing there in front of the sergeant hearing all of these things. And what I really wanted to say was, why is he lying? But I was so scared, so young, I didn't really know what was going on. And I was so scared of them telling my parents that I actually pretended that my friend Mark Rangel was my uncle. And my friends had managed to ring him and he came to pick me up. And then the police let me go. I got back home about midnight and I pretended to my parents that I was babysitting for someone because I had to be in at 9 o'clock. It was already 12 o'clock. The thing is, back then, if you was ever arrested, I don't know if it's the same now, but if you're arrested and you're under 18, they're going to call your parents. So when I got home and I told my parents that I was babysitting, they knew I was lying because the place that I was babysitting at, they were looking out the window the whole time, so they saw me running around the back of the house to get in. And when I told my parents that I was arrested, they didn't believe me because the policeman hadn't called. So my dad came in and he beat me quite badly, because as far as they was concerned, I was out all night doing what I wanted to do. I couldn't have been arrested. And I remember, my dad beat me with a belt, and then I kind of got up in the morning and I explained to my mum what had happened, and they believed me. But when I told them, what had happened, they couldn't believe that something so simple, that I must have done something more. But I was just a 16-year-old little kid who didn't know any better.
Freedom's child, you've been denied too long. Fill your lungs and cry rage. Step forward and take your rightful place. You are not going to grow up knocking at the back door.
I'm working on a bust here of Marcus Garvey.
The Garvey movement was formed by a Jamaican in America in the early part of the 20th century. And it's acknowledged that his movement recruited millions of people. This was a multicultural empire that we'd come from. The big empire that covered a third of the world's surface didn't consist of purely white people and white kings and queens. We weren't taught anything about that. And we were becoming increasingly conscious. We lived through the 60s.
The birth of black power in the United States. And it affected and influenced us, black people all over the world. Whether you're in Jamaica or you're here. It gave us a sense of pride. It gave us a sense of the possibilities.
The advent of people like Bob Marley and reggae music and that whole black consciousness thing made people start reevaluating their attitudes towards other black people, particularly when you're with the whole kind of Back to Africa movement and looking at your roots, and realising that actually we all came from there somewhere.
A lot of other places try to deny any connection with Africa, accept European ideas that Europeans are the pinnacle of civilization, and try and become like Europeans. Jamaicans tend not to do that. Rastafarianism started in Jamaica. Rasta looked to Africa. It said Haile Selassie was our king. He wasn't Jesus, who you have as a white, blonde-haired, blue-eyed man. We want an African with an afro that looks like us.
So, for example, in the schoolyard in Jamaica, when you were growing up, the only notion of Africa and Africans you have is the one that Africans have tails and they live up in trees. Or even the Tarzan movie view of the Africans with the white missionary in a pot dancing around. You understand? So Africa had to be regained and cleansed and remade in our own positive image.
The Black Panther movement was established in Brixton itself, and many of my colleagues joined it. Our youth club became radicalised.
I almost kind of learnt second-hand, if you like, but my older sisters, for example, they were of an age where, they were sort of 17, 18, that kind of age. They had friends who were beginning to become very much more conscious. There was a whole black awareness movement, if you like. I think it kind of kicked off from what was going on in America and the whole civil rights movement. Things like Malcolm X and the Black Panthers were around. Angela Davis, Soledad Brothers, there were lots of protests going on in the States.
Two of the really important black activists, Eric and Jessica Hunkley, and eventually they became the first black publishers in Europe. They would have book launches, poetry evenings where people would come and read their poems. And it was like a central place where you could go.
My greatest education came through Jamaican culture and black music from across the diaspora, mostly Jamaican culture, in two ways, Rastafari and reggae music.
A lot of people were embracing the Rastafarian religion, what we call the Rastafarian religion. And that was like, so a lot of it was back to Africa. There was a lot of music reflecting that as well. Bob Marley put a lot of pride into black people, and I think we had a lot more respect. People had respect for black people, but more to the point, young black people, young black men, they loved each other.
I had a mentor as a Rastafari when I was 11. So we're talking 1968. So I was learning bits about Rastafari from then. And one of the things that I learned was, as an African person, I do have a value, I do have a history, I have contributed in the same way, and I'm an equal member of the human family as anyone else.
The Rasta philosophy is a peaceful philosophy. It's a shame that we lost Bob Marley because there used to be so much mainstream reggae music played on the radio, and most reggae music in those days was about peace and love. It still is.
My brother he went to school here, but by the time he was 16, he had a choice. He wanted to become a Rastafarian, you know, grow his hair, and my parents were just not into that kind of thing. I mean, having hair like this now is the norm, but back then it was a big taboo. Nobody, you know, black people, even though it's a black thing, they didn't really like it. So my brother had the choice. He could have no locks and stay at home, or have locks and leave, and he decided to leave.
People like my parents would look down on a Rasta. You could never bring a Rasta to the house, and a lot of guys did it to rebel, and a lot of people did it because they were looking for something to believe in.
The music and the lyrics were reflecting our lived experiences. Although a lot of it then was coming from Jamaica, we still could identify with what was going on. So if it was about problems at home with our parents, problems with the educational system, problems with the police, disproportionality in the criminal justice system, all of that was being taught through reggae music, but crucially, we were also taught how to love through reggae. And this often gets missed as well, because reggae music taught us that as human beings, you have to love, you have to learn to love.
The anger and acute sense of frustration and abandonment felt by the community erupted powerfully to bring about momentous changes to modern British history.
The situation facing both the host community, the indigenous population, if you will, and the Afro-Caribbean community in the 1970s was highly stressful in any event.
And then a critical event happened. There was the Yom Kippur War in the Middle East, and the Arabs put up the price of oil precipitously, and that hit Western economies, Britain in particular, heavily. I remember there wasn't enough fuel to keep the lights on. Brixton started to decline as a retail area, as a commercial area. And as our younger brothers and sisters were coming out of school, concomitantly, there's no jobs for them. That was the kind of environment in which I was coming out of college. I had to find a job.
This was a time of quite serious economic crisis and decline in the UK economy. There was increasing pressure on employment of all kinds.
And that new 80s generation who were unemployed, very little economic prospects, or organised around, again, ska or black Caribbean music as a resistance music. It talked about growing up on council estates, having no prospects. In fact, one of the bands was called UB40. UB40 is the form that you fill in when you're unemployed. Labour came in 74, they passed the new Race Relations Act in 76, which gave, for the first time, proper rights to black people, that if you were discriminated against to get a job, or went to a pub and you wanted a drink and they refused to serve you, all of these kind of blatant forms of racism were made illegal for the first time. The Notting Hill Carnival was functioning as the largest expression of African Caribbean sensibilities in the United Kingdom, increasing focus on black youth as criminal, as aberrant, as antisocial was coming to a head. And a lot of young people used to go to the carnival. There they were all massed on the street in Notting Hill. Not only there gaily displaying costumes, but now you had sound systems on the corners. Some incident happened. I'm not sure exactly what caused the upsurge, but the confrontation between some police and the young people happened, and the young people used their numbers to overwhelm the police. Then the next challenge was in the streets of Lewisham in 1977. The National Front was very active. There were sections of working class, sections of society being detached and wind the idea that it was immigration that was the problem. There were couple of thousand National Front people and 50, 100,000 people to oppose them. Police were out in force again to protect their democratic right to march.
People are really rather afraid that this country might be rather swamped by people with a different culture. And you know, the British character has done so much for democracy, for law, and done so much throughout the world.
She took some of the themes from Enoch Powell and from the National Front and used it as official Conservative Party propaganda in the 79 election. And she was elected by a landslide because the ordinary people thought she had their interest at heart.
I think one of the big things was the whole relationship with the police. It had always been problematic, but certainly toward the beginning of the 80s, in Lambeth and Brixton specifically, where we were growing up, the police, it was almost like they had this perception that, you know, black people are criminals, therefore, if the only people that you meet who are black are criminals, then it's easy to assume that every black person is a criminal.
In 1981, there was locally here, just a few streets from where we're sitting, a house fire.
A group of young people having a birthday party in New Cross, and it's disputed precisely what caused the fire, but a fire took hold in the house, and a number of people weren't able to escape, and 13 young black people died. Maggie Thatcher's government had not long been in power. They made no statement about this state of affairs. Had 13 young white people died in a house fire, the Prime Minister would have been seen to have written to the families with condolences. The Queen would have written to them. None of this happened.
There was a march protesting against those incidents. You know, many people still believe, a right to believe, I think, that was a racially inspired attack.
And there'd been a history of racists pouring petrol through people's letterboxes in that part of London when people had social events, because they didn't like noise, they didn't like black people living in their neighbourhoods. The police who came and who investigated it were amateurs, to say the least. Right? They didn't systematically gather the evidence. They came with the paradigm that somehow these people were responsible for it themselves because they want to have parties and they go and disturb everybody, right? And they get what they deserve. So the community mobilised and demanded action. And a march was organised, and this became what's called the Black People's Day of Action. In the process of the march, young people there attacked the mainstream press's buildings threw paint and other things at their windows and showed that they felt that those papers were racist and anti-black.
The next day, the headline in the popular press was "A Black Day at Blackfriars." You know, the media was deeply implicated in the negative representation of those communities.
The police had decided they felt that the priority problem in Brixton was street crime. And to neutralise street crime, they organised a campaign called Swamp 81. You remember the last person I said used that term? Mrs. Thatcher said that she felt the ordinary English person felt rather swamped by us.
We used to have a lot of stop and search going on, and at the time there was a special police unit called the Special Patrol Group. Yeah, and they were almost like a SWAT team. They used to just appear and sort of leap out of vans and jump on people and stuff. It was crazy.
This went to the extent that my mother, one Saturday, going to the Brixton market to do her shopping, my mother's getting on for 70 by this stage, stopped and her shopping bag was searched.
My older sister, the first time she went through the education system here, I remember her first car was some beat-up little old car that she got when she first started teaching, and she saved and bought herself a brand new car. And she actually, as a woman, she was stopped several times driving this brand new car and questioned, where did you get this car from? So it's, do you see what I mean? It's like, if somebody stops and asks you, like, you know, well, is this your car? Can I see your license? Whatever, fine. But if the first question is, where did you get this car? Do you see what I mean? There's an assumption there that you shouldn't be in that kind of vehicle, or it's not yours.
On the one hand, this is a story about the way in which racism is institutionalised in the police force and through the wider society. But also what was interesting for people like myself, you know, who had black friends, who saw the police pick black people out of a crowd of mixed people? Was it a moment of thinking, this is what racism actually is? It was like a political education to live through that moment too.
Now this, on top of Newcastle fire, sent the atmosphere in the community to, you know, fever pitch. So it was no by accident that one Saturday evening, on 10th of April, 1981,
I was coming home, and as I got to Kennington, I started to see burnt out cars and upside down cars and stuff. And as I was going further in towards Brixton, it was just everything was burnt out and all the windows were smashed. An explosion of anger.
That Saturday afternoon, you know, all of a sudden there was all this noise. We could hear like whirring sounds, and it was a police helicopter overhead. And everyone was like, what's going on? And turn the TV on, it's like, there are riots going on in Brixton. It's like, are you sure? You know, we're down the road.
I was aware of it because it happened one street away from where I lived. My friends came and said, you got to come, there's a big thing going on up there. So I closed my door, and me and my friend Eric, we walked to Railton Road, and we saw a group of 6 men, young men from the front line. A mini car was parked. Between them, they picked up the car, and they heft it into the middle of the street, turned it over. When the petrol ran out, they put a rag there and lit the car.
The whole place had just literally erupted. You know, there had been a series of incidents, if you like, and a build-up. And I don't even get what the final trigger was, but one incident.
The police tried to send in a squad, and they were beaten back. They then commandeered a bus, got the driver to get out the bus, the policeman got in the bus, and they tried to use the bus to ram the car out of the way. The bus went out of control, the policeman jumped out and ran away. So it was like Keystone Cop stuff. And I remember walking around on a Sunday, and it was literally like you were in the middle of a war zone. I was thinking, this is not my hometown. Walking up Railton Road, walking up the surrounding streets, shop windows broken out, all the things inside there, you know, mannequins kind of, you know, it was literally like a dystopian vision. It was a carnival of resistance.
I would say, you know, unequivocally, before the Brixton riots, you know, black youth were treated like shit by the police, by the system, by everybody, and they didn't care. We were invisible. We didn't have a voice.
What the riots did was put the whole issue of what was going on in these communities onto the political agenda.
Radical events cause radical change, or radical change comes through radical events. The Brixton riot was one of those because it gave us a visibility, and it made the wider white community, the government, the police, everybody realize we were born here. As far as we're concerned, we've got a right to be here, and we're not going anywhere unless we feel like it.
Within a couple of days, the government decided how they were going to deal with this. Firstly, Maggie came out with a number of statements about, oh, this is just criminality, it's pure criminality. They have no reason why they should be doing this.
Margaret Thatcher came down like that. Blimey, what's happened here? Anyway, the whole place was burnt out.
It's almost like there was a general feeling that, oh, these people who are moaning about stuff, black people were just moaning, or if you made a complaint about something, you had a chip on your shoulder. If you talked about being discriminated against, you were just feeling sorry for yourself. Yeah. But once Brixton exploded, you know, then you got all the media attention, you got all the politicians down, people asking why. And
then named that they were going to set up an inquiry. It was going to be headed by a judge called Lord Scarman.
what had been going on, what people's feelings were, and a lot of decisions were made on the back of that. There was a lot of soul searching. Why has this community gone up in flames? And they actually started to talk to people, you know, in some cases for the first time.
Maggie Thatcher authorised the release of large amounts of state funding into those areas. So the councils were giving money to start fixing up houses, fixing the roads, painting things, and to create training and employment opportunities. So British state are not stupid. The ruling class are not idiots. They knew they had to assuage the anger.
Lots more things came to light that the wider society hadn't necessarily been aware of. There were also people who could articulate it as well. So, you know, when they actually talked to people, they could string a sentence together. They could give you an analysis of what was going on, yeah. They could speak in terms that politicians could understand.
In the run-up to 1978 local government elections, a left-wing faction had taken over the Labour Party in Lambeth. And they approached us and said, what do we see as the priority issues? If we were going to persuade the black community to vote Labour, what policies do we want to see? So we could produce what was called the Black Agenda, which was what was priority for us in terms of educating our children, policing, housing, the whole full gamut. And we put them to Ted Knight and his administration, and he agreed that he would campaign on those issues. And, you know, surprise, surprise, they won a landslide victory in the local elections that year.
They supported a lot of the organizations that were black, the arts organizations. Some of the first art galleries were supported by, the supplementary schools were supported by a bookshop that sold left-wing and black books. All of these things were supported by the GLC under Ken Livingstone.
A lot of the councils in these areas were very left-wing councils who had a very serious critique of Maggie Thatcher and her policies. People like Ken Livingstone, Ted Knight, quite on the left of the Labour Party. But yet still there are authorised funds to be spent in those areas because that's where the challenge was coming from.
When Maggie Thatcher came to power, she decided that the council, the Greater London Council, was too far to the left.
It was mainly the Labour Party initially which introduced both of these kind of strategies, both equal opportunities policies and diversity quotas, if you will. This took place mainly in London, in Lambeth, in Southwark latterly, and earlier on in Wandsworth. Increasingly also it took place in Manchester, in Birmingham and in Liverpool under the Labour authorities there.
It was a continual wars between the central government and local government, which local government can't win because the central government hold the purse strings. 75% of the money for local government comes from central government.
The reform of simple things like the mechanical process of getting a job through equal opportunities initiatives, which was a major effort here in Manchester, for example, had a big effect in terms of raising the number of people employed by both large firms and local authorities.
Lambeth was the groundbreaker, it was the forerunner. And what really opened the doors was what happened in '81. A whole phalanx of people started to be sucked into employment in councils, in colleges, in the National Health Service, in the public sector generally. Yeah? And so what the actions of young people had done was to challenge people and them seeing they've got to open the door because with people locked out, if they have no opportunity, they're going to tear down the whole system. So the system opened the door a little bit.
People from ethnic minorities, both the Afro-Caribbean community and others, are much more prominent and represented in British politics than they were even 20 years ago. Now, this has a number of causes. One is simply greater activism or organisation on the part of minority groups. Partly because of their geographical concentration, ethnic minority groups are a particularly attractive vote group to go for because they're going to have a disproportionately big impact in certain seats under the British electoral system of first past the post.
My organisation has started around that time and we got commissions from councils and the government to do work to open up economic opportunity for the black community. Now this was surreptitious. This was never done publicly. Nobody ever advertised the fact that there was going to be black empowerment taking place, like in South Africa when it became free. It was done covertly.
It led to a shift in the policy of the Thatcher government under Michael Heseltine and subsequently the new Labour government in a way that led to a greater integration of certainly parts of that community into the wider British life.
And they made decisions, for example, to build large council estates. The quality of those builds were not very high, in my opinion. Quality of design, the quality of maintenance was low. But these were the places that all of a sudden we now had access to. When we saw this, campaigned against them doing this, because we could see the long-term consequences. But the council went ahead. And if you listen to UB40's lyrics, it talks about living on these soulless estates, with rubbish around you, rats, all that kinds of stuff, which came out of failure of local government policies and government policies from the 70s and early 80s.
London's geography was kind of redefined through the lens of a kind of racialised and racist imagination.
I had a band at the time, Skank Orchestra. We used to play around in Brixton, the Academy, places like that. And we did this song called Scarman Inquiry, which became like really popular. And it was, we used to, you know, Scarman Inquiry, make the people feel irie, irie, irie. Scarman Inquiry, make the people feel irie, irie, irie. Scarman Inquiry, make the people feel irie, irie, irie. The white man say is the black man say is the white man.
Darcus Howe came from Trinidad to study law and got involved in a series of events over in West London where there was a Caribbean restaurant that the police tried to close down. And they actually demonstrated against the attacks by the police on the Mangrove. It's called the Mangrove Restaurant. And he was locked up for assaulting, and they fought and fought and fought for years against the setup by the police, and eventually they won. He also was the chair of an organization called Race Today that actually produced very radical left-wing articles around race and the position of black people within this community.
From that came The Voice, which this is after the riots, and that was a national black newspaper, our first.
This whole opening has started as on the back of this urban insurrection, because money, resources were starting to come in. So you had a vehicle now, a newspaper, who would cover what you were doing, who would promote your dances, where you could advertise what you were doing, your records and your cultural production, would cover sympathetically marches, demonstrations, events. Also, councils were now required to advertise jobs and opportunities that should cover black people.
Identity politics is, I think, a growing feature of all Western democracies. And it's a feature, it's a reaction, I think, to the way that the world economy and the economy of parts of the world in particular has developed in the last 30 to 40 years.
This newspaper was launched at Notting Hill Carnival in 1982. Free copies of the newspaper were given away at the carnival.
And it became very important because police, authorities, all the stories about police brutality, deaths in police custody, all these things were like on the front page of The Voice. Scarman Inquiry, make the people feel irie, irie, irie. The white man say is the black man say is the white man. But I don't know, everywhere I go, violence by the policeman. The white man say is the black man say is the white man. But I don't know, everywhere I go, violence by the policeman. Scarman Inquiry, make the people feel irie, irie, irie. Scarman Inquiry.
By the 80s, Brixton had established itself as the vibrant and diverse black capital of Europe, a place pulsating with energy and ideas.
Back in those days as well, Brixton was buzzing. I mean, if you went down Railton Road or the Atlantic Pub, you know, I mean, it was like West End. You know what I'm saying? It's just like buzzing. We'd have what like you call underground clubs. So you'd have a shop upstairs, and underneath you'd have be like a disco, you know.
I get very patriotic about London generally, but about Brixton specifically, because it really is home turf.
It was never a place where people walk around with glum faces. It was always a happy place.
We used to come down here for sweet potatoes, plantains, any kind of Caribbean spices, even clothes. You know, if my mum needed to buy us clothes, you know, I'd have my little trolley, I'd have to pull it for my mum, and, you know, I'd see my friends from school down here all playing around, and I couldn't play. You come down to Brixton to get your hair cut, my dad would bring me down here to get my hair cut, and it just became an area for us to kind of, you know, treat it like where we all came from. I mean, I was born here, but, you know, my family felt really comfortable around here.
Race Today, which is a militant black organisation, was a few yards away from the Gay Liberation Front, who were next door to anarchist organisation, who were next door to social workers, international socialists. Every type of radical group was based.
And one of the ways how we spread that radicalism was through sound system culture and reggae music.
Music is universal, yeah, and it has a language of its own that is universal. And so long as once there's a beat and a rhythm, people get into it. And I think people like Bob Marley, I think, played a huge part in that whole kind of racial mixing.
So black music provided an avenue for a new generation to find itself, to express and feel what life was about for them.
I had a radio station called Climax FM at the time, which was a pirate station, which we used to play house music, and then also used to keep raves as well.
A whole series of pirate radio stations were set up out in the Thames Estuary, on ships, and so on, until the BBC created Radio 1 and allowed popular music.
Grace, my younger sister, and she was the very first person to have a music show on Channel 4 called Club Mix. Artists from America, the Womacs, and I mean, everybody was on that show. It was amazing.
In the 80s, it was more kind of soul and funk, and it was a mixture of everyone, you know, just having a good time.
Then a new craze started, which was house music and acid house music, and that's when people used to keep what we call raves. Now, so what would happen is someone would go and maybe rent a hangar in a farm, and then they'd tell everybody where it's going to be, and it would start maybe at 1 o'clock in the morning, and you just see hundreds of people going across the field into this airport hangar, and then you get in there and it'd be a massive rave. House music is gospel music. Say a Little Prayer for You, Aretha Franklin. You know, that's a religious song. And then you got gospel dance music, which became dance music. Rap music was developed and started in Jamaica, because what we used to call it is chat. So we had a DJ would talk over a record.
Even for like the Brixton riots, you had the sound systems, you know, telling people you've got a right to belong here. No one should treat you like that. Don't accept that kind of treatment. Maybe your parents accepted it, but we, our generation, will not accept that, which is why Linton Kwesi Johnson, the famous dub poet, said, we were the rebel generation.
There's a great big mystery, and it sure is worrying me. This city war did it. This city war did it. I wish somebody would tell me what city war.
The relentless, violent and discriminatory exertion of power by the police force has been and remains one of the most contentious fractures between the British state and the community.
In those days, if somebody got arrested, if you hear that someone got arrested, the first worry would be, would they come out of the police station alive?
In '85, Cherry Gross was a woman who lived not far from where we are now, Normandy Road.
A load of police turned up at her house one morning looking for her son.
And raided her house, kicked her door off, and when she staggered out of bed at 2 in the morning, they shot her and she was paralysed. A week later, another group of policemen stormed into the home of another woman called Cynthia Jarrett in Tottenham and pushed her over, and she died. So within a week, 2 mothers inside their homes had been attacked by policemen.
And this caused what was now known as the second riot in Brixton.
Around the same time, there'd been the national strike of miners. The miners, you'd never seen such carnage. Maggie Thatcher and our government organised the police against the National Miners Union. She saw them as her main opposition, and she was determined she was going to smash them, because the miners particularly had defeated the Conservative governments in the 70s. And she had planned very meticulously, and the miners were out on strike for over a year. Our defence campaign in Brixton remembered raising money for the miners. We went up to the miners' village near Manchester with the things we'd collected. And we met in a miners' lodge, which is a miners' social club. And they said to us, we didn't understand. When we saw you fighting police on the street, we thought you were criminals. And it's not until we've had to confront the state ourselves here we understood. And we really appreciate what you've done. You brought us food and you brought us clothes. And now we're starting to understand your struggle. So across racial divides, because of challenge against people started to see their common interest.
Some politicians actually have the nerve to talk about government by diktat. The irony is that those who urge us to intervene in the coal dispute and seem angered when we don't are the very people who accuse us of being dictatorial.
The whole police force was white. So, of course, in Jamaica, for instance, if you had a cousin or a brother who was a police officer, you'd be proud. You'd say, oh, you know, my cousin's a police officer, so we're safe, you know? But over here, it was like you wouldn't have anything to do with the police.
The 1999 Macpherson report, an investigation into the murder of Stephen Lawrence, stated for the first time that the Metropolitan Police were institutionally racist.
I find it difficult after 5 years for the Commissioner to still be saying that he felt that there was no racism or corruption involved in Stephen's case. So if that wasn't racism and it wasn't corruption, I still haven't been given the answer as to why Stephen's killers are still walking free.
Stephen Lawrence, who was, stabbed to death by 5 white youths from Welling or around that way, a number of years ago.
So nobody really wanted to take this case forward, and Doreen Lawrence, she just wouldn't let go, and she's a remarkable person. She fought for years and years to get justice for him. The Stephen Lawrence case was also a wake-up call for the black community.
These guys had killed him. They'd got away with it for a very long time. It was only in the last couple of years that 2 of them were actually convicted for the murder.
The way to educate the police, the white police, was to have black police, which was not a very popular thing to say. But it inspired me to do the campaign, which we did, which was Taking Care of Business, which was a recruitment campaign which we did with the Metropolitan Police to get black police officers into the force.
Too low when you think about it. 3% of our police get it. Now we the ethnic minority. Want security, safety, and unity. Let's get in patrolling. Providing ourselves with appropriate policing. Oh yeah. Listen to my people.
The African Caribbean community in the UK came together repeatedly, generation after generation, to face bitter challenges along their journey.
After the Thatcher years, people lost their way a bit, and I think it was the culture was more about me, and money. Crack cocaine was becoming a part of the community, taking set on the community.
For young black men, there is a particular issue because there's also the problem of exclusion from schools. So, for example, about 38% of young African Caribbean men are excluded from school in a year. That is very worrying. Why are nearly 40% of young black men being excluded from school? Why is it that 1 in 5 young black men may end up in some kind of criminal system or judicial system?
A lot of the guys who were hustling were doing a lot better than hard-working people.
And there has been a lot of talk about young men in the UK not having positive role models, and that all of the black men that they see are people in gangs, people in music videos, people on the television.
So, of course, if you see someone driving past in a BMW or a Mercedes or Aston Martin, you'd be like, well, I want to be like that, you know what I'm saying?
For a lot of ethnic minorities, when you're in a minority within a majority culture, you may feel like when you go into the workplace or you go into certain environments, you may have to change and take on something that's different. And for some people, they struggle with that. And I think with some of these gangs, you know, the elders in the gangs who behave like big brothers, you know, kind of take these young people under their wing and sort of say, don't worry, you know, you're with us, we'll show you the ropes, you know, you could be yourself. Some of the people who are willing to manipulate young people prey on vulnerable young people that don't have support at home. They lean on them as if they're like big brothers and family members and get them to do things. And they often get the younger ones to do things for them, and they manipulate their position. So what we hope is happening now with a change of culture in terms of having more positive young black people out there is that young people see that's not the way. I can go another way.
You never really saw a black artist on TV. Everything was very rare. You didn't see any, you know, black music artists, you didn't see any actors, you didn't see anyone. If you did, it was such a big thing.
But there's also this idea of relatedness or belonging. And feeling that you belong to part of a group and you can relate to people is really important for your own motivations and your beliefs about yourself and your abilities.
I'm watching TV, but it's not on, but I prefer. I'm watching TV, and it's not on, but I prefer.
They persistently resisted powerful forces of oppression and claimed their rightful place in British society. Their interventions catalysed pivotal social changes that turned Britain into its modern, open and diverse self, establishing London as one of the most progressive, multicultural cities in the world.
That journey of getting to the Caribbean and coming from Africa and slavery and what happened there had a big impact on how families were set up in the Caribbean and what continued. So, you know, young black men that were slaves were encouraged to have multiple relationships and have lots of children because it created more slaves. These things have an impact, and it has impact in terms of what kind of society it created in the Caribbean and how that transferred to when people came to the UK.
My husband had great respect for people. And he was very trustworthy. When he worked on the buses and on the train, he had so many friends. And some of these black men, when they finish working, they're going to play cards or domino. He's always going home. You know what time he'll be home. And some of the guys will say, oh, Bailey, your wife and children all right. And why rush? He said, no, no, no. You never stay back and play games. Finish work, home. And that was great. It was a wonderful father.
My mum was the one that held everything together. You know, she was, you know, my dad would obviously work, come home, he'd give my mum his wages, she'll do her thing, and she'll do the best she could. And with 6 of us living in one house, I mean, she done an amazing job.
My wife was very rare. She spent 35 years in the city, and she hardly saw any black people. Nowadays, you've got a few more black people, black traders in the city, but it's still a glass ceiling.
Cultural fit as a concept isn't the problem, it's how it's used sometimes to mask underlying prejudice or bias. So, for example, if a young person is very much into a hip hop or urban culture, but they have really high grades and they apply to a corporate company, some organisations, when they get to the assessment centre or when they get to interview, it may feel like, or they may express that they may not fit into the cultural environment of that organisation.
Well, the private sector has become much more inclusive of minorities of all kinds, and there's a straightforward explanation for this. It's the working of the profit motive. If you are running a private business and you're looking to make money to make a profit on your activities, then you are actually doing yourself harm if you do not recruit the best possible staff, you do not promote the best possible people to positions within the company.
Because there's so much money in football now that they can't stop black people. So what happens is if you find that, say, you know, they say, oh, black people are only good at sport. But actually, it's not that they're only good at sport, it's that with sport, it's based on performance.
Some people want certain kinds of people to work for them, or they want people like them to work with them. And, you know, that's how they want their organisations to run. Now, that's not in line with the Equality Act, that's not in line with wider kind of social acceptance, but a lot of people do that. They employ people who look like them and who are like them.
It seems like what happens is all kinds of racial stereotypes are shown, you know, without being narrated in words. You just think about the way in which crimes are reported, whether the mugshot of the criminal is used. You know, so in a way, I think the challenge of our time is that racism has moved out of language into another kind of key or another kind of mode.
In fact, I'll go back to yesterday. I was on my bike and I was riding up the street on the pavement, and a guy spotted me, and the first thing, as soon as he saw me, saw me coming, and he went and he grabbed his bag really quickly. And I said to him, seriously? And I carried on riding. I kind of put in a lot of effort trying to make other people feel comfortable. I would never get on an escalator right behind somebody. If it's late at night and I'm walking down the street and I see a woman walking my way, I would cross the road for her because I know that she's going to be in absolute fear. I would say the best way I could explain it, imagine being a suspect all your life.
One of the things about entering the world of academia was a big eye-opener for me. But it also showed me some of the worst aspects of academia, like the classism that's in there, the inherent racism that's in there as well, the sexism that's in there within academia, which is still there. It made me understand the social processes that underpin a lot of this stuff. So I got to understand the conceptual frameworks for why people think the way they do.
They're also looking for, and what extracurricular activities do you do? And do you speak any languages? And do you play instruments? Because they're looking for this rounded person. And in a sense, there's a bias in that. That is biased towards certain people who have access to money, and it will lean towards either mainly white middle class people or other middle class young people.
Them talk, them talk. Can we talk about needing jobs? Can we talk about cleaning blocks? Can we talk about grief and loss? Can we talk about the young black boys?
Gentrification is really interesting. It's a big topic at the moment, particularly in areas like Brixton and Dalston, where they were known to have a strong Caribbean community culture. And they've now become very popular, cool, artsy districts and areas.
It's almost like London is becoming more banlieurified, you know. You can speak about the banlieurification of London, where, you know, the centre becomes the rich playground of those who can afford it, and the edges are the places where those people who are priced out of the centre have to move to.
If you take that alongside what's happening with music and black youth culture, it's almost this idea of being reappropriated, but black people being taken out of it.
Notting Hill Carnival, which is now known across the whole of the world, was originally formed by a group of people called the Mangrove Club, which was a group of community, the West Indian community who lived in Ladbroke Grove. And every year they wanted to celebrate like they do in Trinidad.
You know, Stuart Hall commented, think about the cup of tea, the quintessential icon of Englishness. Where does the sugar come from? Where does the tea come from? It doesn't come from Croydon.
there's this perception of the black community as if it's a homogenous body of people, and it's not. For a start, there are people who... There are so many different Caribbean islands, right? Each Caribbean island has its own identity, yeah? Then you've got so many African countries, each of which has its own identity. I think what was interesting about Black Britain, if you like, or Black British people, is it's kind of like the Jamaican culture that is the dominant culture here.
Nowadays, you listen to young white children or young teenagers, young black teenagers in London, if you close your eyes, you can't tell what colour they are.
Race relations in the United Kingdom are vastly better than those in the United States. Now, there are two reasons for this. One is that here in Britain, although historically we were a slave trading nation, we do not have the extremely poisonous legacy of widespread slavery that is still found in the United States. The other major difference, I think, is that since the 1980s, the relations between the law enforcement authorities and ethnic minorities in this country have improved, whereas in the United States, they have, if anything, become even worse over that whole period.
One of the things about London is it's almost like a country within the country. London's about 40% ethnic minority, and then within that there's quite a lot of mixed race and interracial relationships. And I think that changes your perspective, and I find that myself, you know, I have Jamaican, Irish and Nigerian in my immediate family. I know for me, I can see it as nothing but an advantage because I don't necessarily look at people and have stereotypes in the same way, because if you have Nigerian family and you have Irish family and you have Jamaican family, you'll become very aware of the fact that all of these people have different opinions about different things, but they also have similarities. And so you don't see the world in such a binary way.
Mixed race people have almost become like an ethnic group of their own, yeah? Because everybody does mix so much more.
One of my daughters on her 18th, when she had her 18th birthday party, I reckon you could count about 40 different nationalities in there quite easily, because there was that mix. You know, there were people from Vietnam, there were people from parts of Eastern Europe, there were people from across the continent in Africa, across the Caribbean, other places in Europe. So their experiences of race and racism are completely different from my own.
The youngsters nowadays, they don't know the struggle.
In my parents' generation, I definitely think they were very conscious and actively conscious in terms of verbally, they would speak about it, they'd go to events and rallies, and I think black people were very out there. I think today, young black people, there are still a large number of young black people who are conscious actively in the sense of politically and getting out there in the community, but I think people are conscious in different ways, and I think that social media and online has changed that. So there's lots of online channels of people sharing videos, of people sharing content.
Britain has historically always had a relatively open elite compared to most continental countries. And the British elite has undergone quite an interesting change in both attitudes and outlook over the last 30 years, particularly the media class, the class of people involved in television, radio, the wider media such as the print media.
And the only way things will effectively change is if you have open and honest conversations where people can kind of brace themselves and say, well, maybe I don't like to hear this, but this is these people's truth, and we need to accept it as part of a solution to these ongoing concerns.
Every human being, being a human being by definition, resistance is part of that process. Resistance is about, for example, when you're born as a child, to survive you have to breathe.
In these times, when we are witnessing the rise of xenophobia and racism across the board, the journey of the African Caribbean people in the UK is a precious historical lesson. A benign state of coexistence is possible, and history is of our own making.
I was invited by the Queen to get my MBE.
Well, believe me, I am speaking broad-mindedly. I am glad to know my mother country. I've been traveling the countries years ago, but this is the place I wanted to know, darling London. This is the place for me.
You can't achieve these things on your own. There's got to be that one special word, togetherness.
A little love that slowly grows and grows, not one that comes and goes. That's all I want from you. A little kiss that's more than just a kiss, just one that often leaves. That's all I want from you. Don't let me down. You told me that you care. Remember, when you give, you also get your share. Don't let me down. I have no time to wait. Tomorrow may not come, and dreams may be too late. A little love that slowly grows and grows, not one that comes and goes. That's all I want from you. Don't let me down. You told me that you care. Remember, when you give, you also get your share. Don't let me down. I have no time to wait. Tomorrow may not come, and dreams may be too late. A little love that slowly grows and grows, not one that comes and goes. That's all I want from you.